The wooden platform creaked under her bare feet as men shouted numbers like she was livestock. 23 years old, and Sarah Mitchell was being sold to pay her dead father's gambling debts. Marcus Steele adjusted his worn hat and kept his expression stone cold as he watched from the back of the crowd. His weathered boots and dusty clothes made him look like any other drifter in the Arizona territory. But underneath that carefully crafted disguise was the richest man west of the Mississippi. The auctioneer's voice cut through the desert heat. "Do I hear $50 for this fine young woman? She can cook, clean, and work the fields." Sarah's chin trembled, but she kept her head high. Her faded blue dress was torn at the sleeve, and dirt streaked her pale cheeks. The men in front were eyeing her like wolves circling wounded prey. "50!" called out a fat man with tobacco stains on his shirt. "60!" shouted another, missing half his teeth. Marcus felt his jaw clench. These vultures had no idea what they were bidding on. This wasn't just some transaction. This was a human being's life hanging in the balance. The fat man stepped closer to the platform, his eyes crawling over Sarah's body. 75. "And I want to inspect the merchandise first." Sarah's face went white. She took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. That's when Marcus decided he'd seen enough. $200, he called out, his deep voice cutting through the crowd like a blade. Every head turned. The auctioneer's mouth fell open. 200 was more than most men made in 6 months. 200? The auctioneer stammered. The fat man whirled around, fury in his bloodshot eyes. "Who the hell are you, boy?" Marcus pushed through the crowd, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Up close, they could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark skin weathered by years under the sun. His clothes were simple: leather vest, worn jeans, a hat that had seen better days. Nothing about him screamed money. "Name's Marcus," he said simply. "And I said 200. The crowd murmured in disbelief. Nobody carried that kind of cash, unless they were robbing banks or running cattle for the big ranchers. Sarah stared down at him from the platform, her green eyes wide with confusion and fear. Was this stranger her salvation, or had she just been bought by someone even more dangerous? The auctioneer looked around frantically. "Anyone else?" 200 going once. The fat man spat in the dirt and walked away, muttering curses. "Going twice." Marcus reached into his vest and pulled out a thick roll of bills that made several men in the crowd whistle low. "Sold." But as Marcus counted out the money, Sarah caught something that made her blood run cold. For just a moment, when he opened that roll of cash, she glimpsed more money than she'd ever seen in her life. Who was this mysterious cowboy, and why was he carrying a fortune? The rope chafed against Sarah's wrists as Marcus led her away from the auction block. His horse was a magnificent black stallion that looked far too expensive for a common drifter. But Sarah was too terrified to think clearly about the contradictions. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was scanning the crowd, watching the disappointed bidders disperse with calculating eyes. When the fat man shot them a venomous look before spitting into the dirt, Marcus made a mental note to keep watching their backs. "My property," he finally said, helping her up onto the horse behind him. "About an hour's ride north." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Property. The word hit her like a physical blow. She was property now, owned by this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere with more money than any cowboy should have. As they rode out of town, Sarah noticed things that didn't add up. Marcus's saddle was made of the finest leather she'd ever seen, with silver buckles that caught the afternoon sun. His gun belt was custom-made, not the cheap kind most men wore. And when he'd reached for those bills, she'd seen the flash of what looked like a gold pocket watch. "You're not like the others," she said carefully, testing the waters. "How's that?" "The way you carry yourself, the way you talk to that auctioneer. Most cowboys would have haggled." Marcus felt a muscle tighten in his jaw. She was observant, dangerously so. He'd have to be more careful about maintaining his cover. "Maybe I just knew what I wanted," he said. But that answer only made Sarah more suspicious. Why would any man want her specifically? She was nobody special, just a farmer's daughter whose world had collapsed when her father's gambling debts came due. The landscape around them was harsh and unforgiving. Red rocks jutted up from the desert floor like broken teeth, and the heat shimmered off the ground in waves. Sarah had lived in Arizona her whole life, but she'd never been this far from town. "How much further?" she asked, her throat dry as dust. "Not long now." But as they crested a hill, Sarah saw something that made her breath catch. In the distance, partially hidden by a grove of cottonwood trees, was a house unlike anything she'd expected. It wasn't a small ranch house or a simple cabin. It was a sprawling two-story home with a wraparound porch and what looked like stained glass windows. That's your place?" she asked, unable to hide the shock in her voice. Marcus cursed under his breath. He'd been so focused on getting her away from town safely that he'd forgotten to take the longer route that would have brought them to the modest cabin he'd prepared as a decoy. "It's been in the family," he said quickly, but even he could hear how weak that sounded. Sarah's mind was racing now. The expensive horse, the custom gear, the roll of cash thicker than her wrist, and now this mansion in the middle of nowhere. Who was this man really? As they approached the house, she noticed something else that made her blood run cold. There were no other buildings around, no bunkhouse for ranch hands, no barn full of cattle, just this isolated mansion and them. She was completely alone with a stranger who was clearly lying about who he was, and she was beginning to realize that maybe being bought by the fat man with tobacco stains might have been the safer option. "Marcus," she said quietly as they stopped in front of the house, "what do you really want with me?" Marcus dismounted and helped Sarah down, but she immediately stepped away from him, putting distance between them. Her green eyes darted from the ornate front door to the manicured gardens that no simple cowboy could afford to maintain. "What I want," Marcus said carefully, "is to make sure you're safe." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Safe? You bought me like a piece of cattle and brought me to the middle of nowhere. How is that safe?" She had a point, and Marcus knew it, but explaining the truth would only complicate things further. How could he tell her that he'd been tracking her father's creditors for weeks? That he'd discovered they planned to sell her to cover gambling debts that weren't even legitimate? That he'd spent the last month disguised as a drifter, gathering evidence of their illegal human trafficking operation? Instead, he gestured toward the house. "You must be hungry and thirsty. I'm not going in there with you." Marcus studied her face, the stubborn set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes despite her fear. She wasn't going to make this easy, and part of him respected her for it. "Then we'll sit on the porch," he said. "I'll have Elena bring us something to eat." "Elena? My housekeeper." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "You have a housekeeper? What kind of cowboy has a housekeeper?" Damn. Another slip. Marcus was used to operating in business circles where his cover was much simpler to maintain. This close scrutiny from someone with nothing to lose was dangerous. "She's been with the family for years," he said, sticking to his earlier story. But as if summoned by their conversation, the front door opened and an elderly Mexican woman appeared. She was well dressed in a clean apron and proper shoes, not the rough clothing of someone working on a struggling ranch. "Senor Steele," Elena said warmly, then stopped short when she saw Sarah. "Oh, you didn't tell me we were expecting a guest." Sarah caught the slip immediately. "Senor Steele? I thought you said your name was Marcus." Elena's face went pale as she realized her mistake. Marcus shot her a warning look, but the damage was done. "Marcus Steele," he said quickly. Elena's formal like that, but Sarah was piecing things together now. The expensive house, the well-dressed housekeeper who spoke like she was used to serving wealthy people, the name Steele, that sounded familiar somehow. "Steele," she repeated slowly. "Where have I heard that name before?" Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the desert heat. The Steele name was attached to railroads, mining operations, and cattle ranches across 3 territories. If she connected the dots, "It's a common name," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah took another step back, her mind racing. "You're not just some cowboy, are you? You're rich, really rich." "Sarah, that's why you had all that money. That's why this place looks like a palace." Her voice was rising with each realization. "Who are you really? And why did you buy me?" But before Marcus could answer, they heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast, multiple riders coming hard toward the house, and Sarah realized that whatever game Marcus was playing, they were about to have company. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the house. "Get inside, now! Let go of me!" She tried to wrench free, but his grip was iron strong. "Those riders aren't here for a social visit," he said grimly, scanning the approaching dust cloud. "Elena, get her to the back room and lock the door." But Sarah planted her feet. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's happening." The riders were close enough now that Marcus could make out their faces. 3 men, all armed, all wearing the hard expressions of men used to taking what they wanted by force. He recognized the leader, Jake Morrison. one of the men who'd been orchestrating the debt collection scheme that had put Sarah on that auction block. "They're here for you," Marcus said, his voice deadly serious. "Morrison thinks he owns your father's debt, which means he thinks he owns you." Sarah's blood went cold. "But you bought me fair and square." "Nothing about that auction was fair or square. Your father's gambling debts were artificially inflated by Morrison and his crew. They've been running this scam across the territory, targeting families with young daughters, driving up fake debts, then selling the girls to cover what they claim is owed." The pieces clicked into place for Sarah. "That's why you were there. You knew this was going to happen." Marcus nodded curtly. "I've been tracking their operation for weeks. And you let them sell me anyway?" "It was the only way to get evidence that would hold up in court. But right now, Morrison doesn't care about courts or evidence. He wants you back so he can sell you to someone who'll pay more than $200. The riders were pulling up to the front of the house now, their horses snorting and stamping. Sarah could hear Morrison's voice carrying across the yard. "Steele, we know you're in there!" Marcus's jaw tightened. They knew his real name, which meant his cover was completely blown. "How do they know who you are?" Sarah whispered. "Because I made a mistake," Marcus admitted. "I used my real name on some legal documents while I was investigating them. They must have put it together." Through the front window, they could see Morrison dismounting. He was a big man with cruel eyes and hands that looked like they'd done plenty of violence. The two men with him spread out, flanking the house. "That was a nice trick you pulled at the auction, Steele," Morrison called out. "But you bought stolen property, and we're here to collect." Marcus pulled out his revolver and checked the cylinder. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully. These men are not going to negotiate. They're going to try to take you by force. So what do? We fight." Sarah stared at him. "We? I don't even know how to hold a gun." "Then you learn fast," Marcus said, pulling a second revolver from a cabinet and pressing it into her hands. "Because I'll be damned if I let Morrison get his hands on you after what I paid to get you away from him." Outside, Morrison was losing patience. "You've got 1 minute to send the girl out, Steele. Then we're coming in." Sarah looked down at the heavy gun in her hands, then back at Marcus. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why are you risking your life for someone you don't even know?" Marcus met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something vulnerable in his expression. "Because 3 years ago, Morrison sold my sister the same way he tried to sell you, and I was too late to save her." The front door exploded inward as Morrison's boot connected with the wood. "Time's up. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more where this came from." The front door crashed open and Morrison stepped through, his gun drawn. His two men flanked him, their weapons trained on Marcus and Sarah. Well, Morrison sneered, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "The rich boy thinks he can play cowboy and steal our merchandise." Marcus stepped protectively in front of Sarah, his revolver steady in his hand. "She's not merchandise. She's a human being. She's collateral for a legitimate debt," Morrison shot back. "And you interfered with a legal transaction." "Legal?" Marcus's voice was deadly calm. "There was nothing legal about inflating her father's gambling debts by 300%. Nothing legal about forging documents to make it look like he owed money to people he'd never met." Morrison's face darkened. "You've been busy, haven't you, Steele? Sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Behind Marcus, Sarah gripped the revolver with shaking hands. She could feel the weight of it, foreign and terrifying. But Marcus's revelation about his sister had changed everything. These men had destroyed other lives, and they weren't going to stop unless someone stopped them. "Your sister," she whispered to Marcus. "What happened to her?" "They sold her to a mining camp up north," Marcus said quietly, never taking his eyes off Morrison. "By the time I tracked her down, she was dead, worked to death in conditions no animal should endure." Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Business is business, Steele. Your sister should have minded her own family's debts." That's when Sarah saw something change in Marcus's expression. The careful control he'd maintained since she'd met him cracked, and underneath was a rage so pure it made the air in the room feel electric. "Her name was Catherine," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "She was 19 years old, and she had nothing to do with her father's gambling." "Same as this one," Morrison gestured toward Sarah with his gun. "But that's not my problem." Sarah made her decision. These men had killed Marcus's sister and destroyed countless other families. They were never going to stop unless someone made them stop. She stepped out from behind Marcus, the revolver raised in both hands. It ends here, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Morrison turned his attention to her, amused. Little girl, you ever killed a man before? No, Sarah admitted. But I've got good motivation to start. The room went deadly quiet. Elena had disappeared somewhere into the back of the house, probably hiding, or maybe going for help. The only sounds were the ticking of an expensive grandfather clock and the heavy breathing of 6 people preparing for violence. You know what your problem is, Steele? Morrison said conversationally, as if they weren't all pointing guns at each other. You think money can solve everything, but some problems require a more direct approach. He gestured to one of his men, who started moving towards Sarah. Don't, Marcus warned. But Morrison smiled coldly. See, I figure we kill you, take the girl back and sell her again, this time to someone who won't ask so many questions. That's when Sarah realized that no matter what happened in the next few minutes, her old life was over. The question was whether she'd live to see what came next. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Morrison's man took another step towards Sarah, and she could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. Stop right there, Marcus commanded, but Morrison just laughed. Or what? You'll shoot 3 armed men? Even if you're fast enough to take one of us down? The other 2 will put you in the ground. But Marcus had something Morrison didn't know about. As the richest man in 3 territories, he hadn't survived this long by being unprepared. His hand moved almost imperceptibly toward what looked like an ordinary brass button on his vest. You made one mistake, Morrison, Marcus said calmly. What's that? You assumed I came here alone. Marcus pressed the button, and immediately the sound of pounding hoofbeats filled the air outside. But these weren't random riders. These were his men, armed and trained, responding to a signal he'd triggered. Morrison's confidence wavered for the first time. You're bluffing. The front door that Morrison had kicked in suddenly filled with armed figures. 6 men in professional gear, moving with military precision, surrounded the room in seconds. Drop your weapons, the lead man commanded. Morrison and his crew found themselves outnumbered 2 to 1 by men who clearly knew what they were doing. Who the hell are you people? Morrison snarled. Marcus straightened up, and for the first time since Sarah had met him, he dropped the cowboy act completely. His voice changed, becoming more refined, more authoritative. Allow me to properly introduce myself, he said. Marcus Steele, owner of Steele Industries. These are Pinkerton agents I hired to help me bring down your little operation. Sarah's mouth fell open. Steele Industries was one of the biggest companies in the American West. She'd heard the name whispered in reverential tones back in town. Railroads, mining, cattle, even banks. Marcus wasn't just rich. He was one of the most powerful men in the territory. Pinkerton? Morrison's face went white. The Pinkerton Detective Agency had a reputation for never giving up and never failing to get their man. We've been building a case against you for months, the lead agent said. Human trafficking, fraud, extortion, murder. We've got witnesses, documents, and now we've got you caught in the act. Morrison's gun wavered. He was looking around the room like a trapped animal, calculating his chances of shooting his way out. Don't even think about it, Marcus warned. It's over, Morrison. The only question now is whether you surrender peacefully or we add resisting arrest to your charges. But Sarah was still processing the magnitude of what she'd just learned. You're Marcus Steele, she said quietly. The Marcus Steele. He turned to look at her and she could see regret in his eyes. I'm sorry I lied to you, but if you'd known who I really was from the beginning, I would have thought you were just another rich man trying to buy himself a plaything, she finished. Exactly. Morrison suddenly lurched forward, making a desperate grab for Sarah. But she was ready for him. The gun in her hands bucked as she pulled the trigger, and Morrison screamed as the bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor. The room erupted in chaos as Morrison's men tried to fight their way out. But the Pinkerton agents were professionals. Within minutes, all 3 criminals were on the ground, disarmed and bleeding. Ma'am, the lead agent said to Sarah, are you all right? Sarah looked down at the smoking gun in her hands, then at Morrison writhing on the floor, then finally at Marcus, the real Marcus Steele, not the cowboy she'd thought she knew. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know anything anymore, because the man who'd bought her freedom wasn't who he'd claimed to be, and she just shot a man to protect someone whose real name she'd only learned 5 minutes ago. What kind of life was she walking into? 2 hours later, Morrison and his men were loaded into a prison wagon, bound for the territorial courthouse where they'd face federal charges. The Pinkerton agents had collected their evidence and departed, leaving Marcus and Sarah alone on the porch of his mansion as the sun began to set over the Arizona desert. Sarah sat in a wooden chair, still wearing her torn dress from the auction, staring out at the endless expanse of red rock and sagebrush. The gun that had changed everything lay on the table between them, silent now, but still carrying the weight of what she'd done. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked quietly. He'd changed out of his cowboy disguise into proper clothes, a clean white shirt, dark vest, and trousers that probably cost more than most people made in a year. "Like I don't know who I am anymore," Sarah said honestly. "This morning I was a farmer's daughter being sold like livestock. Tonight I shot a man and discovered that my rescuer is one of the richest people in America." Marcus leaned forward in his chair. "You saved both our lives back there. Morrison would have killed us without hesitation. Maybe, but I keep thinking about your sister Catherine. She never got the chance to fight back." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the desert turn purple in the fading light. Finally, Marcus spoke. "I need to tell you something, Sarah. You're free. Completely free. I've already had my lawyers draw up documents proving that Morrison's debt claim was fraudulent. Your father's real debts have been paid in full. You don't owe anyone anything." Sarah turned to look at him. "What does that mean?" "Exactly. It means you have choices. Real choices." Marcus reached into his vest and pulled out an envelope. "There's enough money in here to buy land anywhere you want, start any business you can imagine, or just disappear and build a new life somewhere no one knows your story." Sarah took the envelope but didn't open it. "And the other choice? You could stay here, with me. Not as someone I bought, not as someone who owes me anything, but as an equal, as someone who chooses to be here." The weight of the decision settled on Sarah's shoulders. She thought about the woman she'd been this morning, powerless, desperate, with no control over her own fate. Then she thought about the woman who'd stood up to Morrison with a gun in her hands, who'd fought for her own life and won. "If I stay," she said slowly, "what would that look like?" "Whatever you want it to look like. You could help me continue the fight against people like Morrison. You could run one of my businesses. You could do nothing at all except figure out who you want to be now that you're truly free." Sarah stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out at the vast landscape before them. Somewhere out there were other girls like her, other families being destroyed by men like Morrison. But now she had the power to do something about it. "Marcus Steele," she said finally, turning back to face him. The mysterious cowboy billionaire. "Just Marcus," he said, "if you'll have me." Sarah smiled for the first time since the auction block. "Well, Marcus, it looks like you just bought yourself a partner." The desert wind carried the promise of tomorrow across the endless Arizona sky, and for the first time in her life, Sarah Mitchell knew that tomorrow belonged to her. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more where this came from.